The swamp did not forgive mistakes. That was the first thing Master Sergeant Alara Voss had learned about the Okefenokee borderlands, not the version tourists visited with their cameras and their rented boats, but the deep interior, the parts that didn't have names on maps, the parts where the water was black and still, and the cypress trees grew so thick that noon looked like dusk and dusk looked like the end of the world. She had learned it the hard way, the way she learned everything, by surviving something that should have killed her, by lying face down in dark water for 6 hours with her nose barely above the surface, breathing through a hollow reed, while 4 men with dogs searched the bank 3 feet above her head, by understanding in her bones that this place had its own rules, and if you didn't learn them it would swallow you without a second thought. That had been 11 years ago. She'd been 23, fresh out of selection, on her first solo field exercise, and she'd made a navigation error that put her in the wrong grid square at the wrong time. The 4 men with dogs had not been part of the exercise. She had never found out who they were or what they were looking for, but she had learned the swamp. Now she was 34, and the swamp was the only place on Earth where she felt something approaching peace. She was lying in it. Specifically, she was lying in 18 inches of dark water at the base of a cypress cluster on the western edge of a nameless lake that appeared on exactly one map in existence, a classified tactical overlay in a server room in a building in Virginia that most people didn't know existed. She had been lying there for 9 hours. She was completely invisible, not the kind of invisible that meant hard to see. The kind of invisible that meant if you looked directly at her, your eyes would slide away and find something else to focus on, because every part of her, her skin, her gear, her rifle, her breathing, had been made to belong to this environment so completely that her absence from it would have been more noticeable than her presence. The rifle was a custom suppressed platform chambered in .300 Norma Magnum, built to her specifications over 18 months by an armorer she trusted with her life, because she'd trusted him with her life twice already, and he'd earned it both times. It had no manufacturer's mark. It had no serial number. It existed in the same category as Alara herself, which was to say it was officially not here. 12 men were. They were across the lake, on the eastern bank, in a compound that had been built to look like a hunting lodge from the air, and functioned as a coordination hub for an operation that 3 intelligence agencies had been trying to untangle for 14 months. The compound had 6 permanent structures, a main lodge, 2 sleeping quarters, a communications building that was disguised as a generator shed, a dock, and a garage containing 3 vehicles. It was surrounded by a perimeter of motion sensors, and 2 roving guards who rotated on a 90-minute schedule. Alara had been watching the schedule for 9 hours. She knew it better than the men running it did. The 12 men inside the compound were not soldiers, at least not officially. They were contractors, fixers, coordinators, the kind of men who existed in the space between official actors and deniable operations, and who had, over the course of 14 months, facilitated a series of events that had resulted in the deaths of 11 American intelligence assets in 4 countries. 11 people with names. 11 people who had families. 11 people who had trusted a network that turned out to have a leak, and the leak traced back to this compound, to the communications building disguised as a generator shed, to a man named Aldrich Vane who had been selling information for 3 years, and had gotten very good at not being found. Vane was inside the main lodge. He had been inside the main lodge for 6 hours. He appeared to be staying the night. Alara's mission was not to kill Aldrich Vane. Her mission was to extract him. That distinction mattered enormously, and it was the reason she had been lying in this swamp for 9 hours instead of completing the job in the first 20 minutes after she'd arrived. Extraction required timing, positioning, a clear route, a window of opportunity that didn't exist yet. The compound was too alert, too covered, too many eyes in too many places. She needed a moment when the geometry of the situation allowed her to move Vane from inside the lodge to a boat. She had hidden in the reeds 200 meters south of her current position, without anyone knowing it had happened until it was too late. She needed the compound distracted. She was working on that. The first complication had emerged at hour 3. One of the 12 men, a broad-shouldered individual she designated Target 7 in her mental map, had deviated from the established rotation pattern and begun conducting irregular perimeter checks on a 20-minute cycle. This was not standard procedure. This meant someone was nervous. Someone being nervous meant the information about this operation had not been as tightly held as her handlers had promised. She had filed that concern away for later and adjusted her timeline. The second complication had emerged at hour 6. A boat had arrived at the dock, not expected, not in any briefing. It carried 2 additional personnel who were now inside the lodge with Vane, which meant the number of bodies she had to account for had gone from 12 to 14, and more importantly, it meant Vane now had 2 additional people between him and any exit. The third complication was the alligator. It had been 3 feet to her left for approximately 2 hours. She had noticed it at hour 7, a 7-foot bull gator lying in the water with the patient immobility that large predators specialized in, its eyes just above the surface, watching her with an expression that communicated nothing except the fact that it had been here long before she arrived and expected to still be here long after she left. Alara had watched it back. She had decided that if she didn't move, it wouldn't move. So she didn't move, and it didn't move. They understood each other. At hour 9, the moment she'd been waiting for began to materialize. The communications building's generator, the real one, which was separate from the disguised communications equipment and powered the compound's exterior lights, had been running continuously since her arrival. She had noted the fuel consumption rate in her first hour of observation. She had calculated when it would need refueling. She had been right to the minute. At exactly the time she predicted, the exterior lights flickered, and 2 of the 12 men went to the generator shed with a fuel canister. This created a 90-second window in which the compound's eastern corner was unlit, and both roving guards were facing toward the generator shed. She didn't use it to move. She used it to place the first piece. From a sealed pouch on her left hip, she removed a small device the size of a matchbook. She'd built it herself from components that could be purchased at any electronics supply store, which was the point. She attached it to a piece of driftwood she'd positioned at the water's edge 3 hours ago. When the generator came back online and the lights returned, the device was invisible. It looked like nothing. It was part of the swamp. At hour 9 in 20 minutes, Alara moved for the first time in 4 hours. She moved in absolute silence, which was not the same as moving slowly. She moved with the economy of someone who had spent years learning that every motion either served a purpose or created a risk, and there was no third option. She crossed 12 meters of open water in 2 minutes, staying submerged to the neck, her rifle above the surface in a dry bag she could open in under 2 seconds. She reached the eastern bank 80 meters north of the compound's perimeter, and rose from the water like something the swamp had grown. Target 7, the irregular checker, was due at the northern perimeter in 4 minutes. She had 4 minutes to get into position. She got into position in 3. Her hide on the eastern bank was a compressed nest of reeds and mud that she'd mentally constructed during her 9 hours of observation, identifying exactly which position would give her sightlines to the compound's 3 exterior guard points, the lodge entrance, the dock, and the route she needed Vane to travel. She settled into it and opened the dry bag and had the rifle up and zeroed within 90 seconds. Target 7 appeared on schedule. He walked the northern perimeter with his rifle slung, hands in his pockets, the posture of someone who had done this many times and found nothing every time and had begun to believe that was a permanent condition rather than a temporary one. He stopped at the corner post. He looked at his phone. Alara watched him through the scope. She was not going to shoot Target 7. She was not going to shoot anyone unless the mission required it, and right now the mission required silence and precision, and the careful dismantling of a situation rather than the loud and irreversible alternative. Every shot was a decision that couldn't be undone. She had learned that at 21, in a training exercise where her instructor had made her sit for 4 hours after a simulated shot and think about what the world looked like differently because of the decision she just made. She had thought it was a strange exercise at the time. She had never forgotten it. Target 7 finished his phone call and walked back toward the lodge. At hour 9 and 40 minutes, Alara activated the device on the driftwood. The effect was modest. A soft, rhythmic sound, irregular, organic, exactly the kind of noise a large animal made when it moved through shallow water on the western bank. Not alarming, not threatening, just present, just the kind of thing that made men in a swamp compound look west. 3 of the exterior guards looked west. She moved east. The compound's southern fence was chain-link topped with wire, solid in 3 sections and compromised in one. A section near the dock where one of the posts had shifted in the soft ground and created a gap at the bottom large enough for a person who was willing to be low enough to use it. She'd identified it in hour 2. She reached it in 40 seconds. She went through the gap and came up inside the compound. She was 30 meters from the lodge door. The 2 guards near the generator shed had their backs to her, watching the western bank where the device was still producing its irregular sound. Target 7 was on the far side of the lodge. The dock guard was looking at the water. She crossed 30 meters in 22 seconds. The lodge door was unlocked. That was the first thing that told her something was wrong, not because unlocked doors were unusual, but because for 6 hours this door had been latched from the inside and now it wasn't, which meant something had changed and she didn't know what. She pushed it open and went in low. Vane was alone. He was sitting in a chair in the center of the room with his hands visible and his eyes on the door, and an expression that told her he had been waiting. Not waiting the way a man waits when he doesn't know what's coming. Waiting the way a man waits when he's been expecting a specific thing and has prepared himself for it. He said in English, "I knew someone would come eventually. I didn't know it would be tonight." Alara had her weapon up. She scanned the room in the 3 seconds it took him to finish that sentence. 2 doors, both closed, windows covered, no one else visible. The 2 men who'd arrived on the boat were not in this room. "Where are the others?" she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Vane said, "I sent them away an hour ago. I needed this conversation to be private." Alara moved to the wall beside the nearest closed door and listened. Nothing. She moved to the second door. Nothing. She came back to the center of the room and looked at Vane. "You knew we were coming." "I've known for 3 weeks," he said. "I'm the one who told you where to find me." She looked at him. She kept her expression neutral the way she kept everything neutral, as a matter of professional practice. But behind it, she was rapidly reassessing everything she thought she understood about this situation. "The intelligence failure," she said. "Wasn't a failure," Vane said. "It was a test. I needed to know if the people I was going to trust could be trusted. 14 months of watching, 3 agencies, hundreds of personnel, only one team that consistently demonstrated the operational discipline I needed." He looked at her steadily. "Your team, you specifically." Alara said nothing. "The 11 assets who died," Vane said. "I didn't cause that. I've been trying to stop it. The leak isn't in my network. The leak is in the agency that's been hunting me, and I have 3 years of documentation that proves it." She looked at him for a long time. The swamp was quiet outside. The device on the driftwood had stopped. The gator was probably still where she'd left it. She said, "If you wanted to come in, you could have made contact through official channels." Vane said, "The official channels are compromised. The leak is in the official channels. I needed someone who could come get me through unofficial ones." He paused. I needed someone who could lie in a swamp for 9 hours and not be seen by 14 armed men. I needed someone who could solve this problem without burning the whole building down. He met her eyes. I needed a ghost. Ilara lowered her rifle slightly. She thought about the 11 names. She thought about the 3 years of documentation and what it would mean if he was telling the truth and what it would mean if he wasn't. She thought about the boat hidden in the reeds 200 meters south and the extraction route she had planned, and whether it still worked if she had a cooperative subject instead of an unwilling one. She said, "Can you walk?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Can you be quiet?" He said, "I've been quiet for 3 years." She almost believed him. She decided that almost was enough to move on. She said, "We're going out the way I came in, through the fence gap at the dock, into the water. There's a boat 200 meters south. You'll be in the water for approximately 3 minutes. How are you with cold water?" He said, "I spent 2 winters in Norway. I'll manage." She said, "You talk when I tell you to talk. You move when I tell you to move. You stop when I tell you to stop. If I tell you to get down, you don't ask why, you get down. If I disappear, you stay exactly where you are until I come back. If I don't come back in 10 minutes, you go due south until you hit the main waterway and you follow it east until you find a road." She looked at him. "Understood." "Understood," he said. She said, "One more question." He said, "Go ahead." She said, "The 2 men who arrived on the boat tonight, who are they?" Vane's expression shifted. "They're the reason I needed tonight to happen tonight. They were sent to verify that I hadn't made contact with anyone. If they'd stayed another 12 hours, they would have found evidence that I had. So I sent them away and I unlocked the door and I waited for you." Ilara processed this. Then she said, "Where did you send them?" He said, "The Eastern Observation Post, about 400 meters from here. They'll be back in approximately 90 minutes. She said, "We're leaving in 3 minutes. She went back to the door and looked through the gap at the compound. The exterior guards were still at their positions. Target 7 was completing his irregular perimeter check. The dock guard had sat down, which was a violation of protocol and the best thing that had happened all night. The generator was running smoothly. The western bank was silent. She came back to Vane. She said, "On me, stay close. Match my pace exactly. Don't reach for anything, don't look at anyone, don't react to anything unless I react first." He nodded. He stood up. He was steadier than she expected. That was either a good sign or a very practiced performance, and she would know which one within the next 20 minutes. They went out the door together. The crossing of the compound took 4 minutes. 4 minutes of moving through shadow and stillness, of timing movements between guard rotations, of using the generator's hum as acoustic cover, of finding the moments when every pair of eyes in the compound was oriented somewhere other than where they were. Vane moved well, better than well. He matched her pace exactly as she told him to, and when she went still, he went still, and when she moved, he moved, and he didn't make a sound. They reached the fence gap. She went through first, he followed. They were outside the perimeter. They entered the water. The cold hit immediately, the way swamp water always did, not just temperature but the specific quality of it, the weight and the darkness and the sense of a living system closing around you. Vane made no sound. He waited after her, staying close, his eyes forward. They reached the boat in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. It was a flat-bottomed aluminum skiff with an electric motor, invisible in the reeds, exactly where she'd left it. She helped Vane in. She pushed off from the bank. She started the motor on its lowest setting, almost inaudible, and they moved south through the black water. Behind them, the compound lights burned steadily. No alarms, no movement, nothing. The swamp closed around them like it was erasing their passage, which it was. At the extraction point, 3 kilometers south, a vehicle was waiting. Ilara had positioned it herself, 48 hours before the operation. A dark green truck registered to a timber company that had gone out of business in 2019. 2 of her people were in it. Warrant Officer Destacamani and Sergeant First Class Reyes Marchetti, both of whom had been read into the operation at the last possible moment, and both of whom were watching the water as the skiff emerged from the reeds. Destat took one look at Vane and then looked at Alara. She said, "He's breathing." Alara said, "We had a conversation." Destat said, "You were supposed to extract him, not have a conversation." Alara said the extraction required a conversation. She stepped out of the skiff and helped Vane to the bank. She looked at Destat. "He has documentation. 3 years. Get him processed and get the documentation to Morrison before anyone else sees it." Destat said, "Why Morrison specifically?" Alara said, "Because Vane says the leak is inside the agency. Morrison is the only person inside the agency I trust without qualification." Destat looked at Vane. He looked back at her calmly. She looked at Alara. "You believe him?" Alara said, "Enough to move on. Get him in the truck." They drove north through the dark. Vane sat in the back between Destat and Marchetti and looked out the window at the trees moving past in the headlights. After 20 minutes he said, quietly, "You lay in that water for 9 hours." "Yes," Alara said from the front seat without turning around. "And you were never seen?" "No." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The gator. Did you see the gator?" "Yes." He said, "Weren't you concerned?" Alara said, "We reached an understanding." Vane looked at the back of her head for a moment. Then he looked back out the window. After a long pause he said, "I've worked in this business for 17 years. I've dealt with intelligence officers, field operatives, analysts, contractors, every category of person this world produces." He paused. "I've never seen anyone operate the way you just did." Alara said nothing. Destat said, "From the back seat, she doesn't take compliments." Alara said, "I take them fine. I just don't require them." Marchetti laughed once. They drove the rest of the way in silence. 3 weeks later, in a conference room in a building that didn't officially exist, Alara sat across a table from 3 people who did not officially exist either and listened while they outlined what Vane's documentation had revealed. The leak had been real. The documentation had been thorough. 2 individuals inside the agency had been identified, one who had been operating for 6 years, one for 11 months. Both were now in custody. The 11 assets who had died over 14 months were being quietly posthumously honored in a ceremony that would never be reported anywhere. Morrison, who was running the briefing, looked at Alara at the end and said, "The operation deviated significantly from the approved plan." Alara said, "The situation deviated significantly from the approved intelligence." Morrison said, "You conducted an unsanctioned conversation with the target." Alara said, "I conducted a necessary assessment. The conversation was the operation." Morrison looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Outcome was correct." Alara said, "Outcome was the objective." Morrison almost smiled. He said, "The division is recommending a commendation." Alara said, "I'd prefer a week off." He said, "You can have both." She said, "Then I'll take the week off." She drove back to the borderlands that evening. Not to the compound, which was now a very different kind of active. To the part of the swamp that didn't have a name. She parked at the tree line and walked in until the sounds of the road disappeared, and all she could hear was water and birds, and the ambient hum of a living ecosystem that had been here for 10,000 years, and would be here for 10,000 more regardless of what human beings did at its edges. She sat on a fallen cypress at the water's edge. After a while, a shape materialized from the reeds to her right, 7 feet, black and still, eyes just above the water line. She looked at it, it looked at her. She said quietly, "We kept our agreement." The gator held its position. Then, with the slow and absolute patience of something that had never once in its life needed to hurry, it turned and slid back into the black water and was gone. Alara sat alone at the edge of the swamp as the sun went down and thought about 11 names and 3 years of documentation. And the way Vane had matched her pace exactly without being told twice, and the look on Desta's face when the skiff came out of the reeds. She thought about the device on the driftwood and the gap in the fence, and the 90 seconds the generator had given her, and the unlocked door that had told her everything had changed. She thought about 9 hours of stillness in black water and what it produced. Then she stopped thinking and just listened to the swamp. It was enough.